Hello, and welcome to Radical Engagements here at Farmblog. And today we are continuing our discussion of Kohei Saito's article, Marxism, Crisis, and Elasticity, from his Reexamining Engels' Legacy in the 21st Century, from the Marxism, Engels, and Marxism, from the Marx, Engels, and Marxism series by Palgrave Macmillan. Can you keep all that in your head? This is a relatively new essay. I believe it was published in 2021. All right. We are in the section of Metabolism, Crisis, and Elasticity called Engels and the Late Lukacs. Shall we venture that it is about Engels and the Late Lukacs? All right, let us go. Looking at the ontology of social being, Lukacs' theoretical shift is clearly discernible in his attitude towards Engels. In Lukacs' theory of metabolism, his general evaluations of Engels became higher. Quote, "It is Engels that we are indebted to for having ascribed labor the central role in man's becoming to be human." George Lukacs, Prolegomena zur Ontologie der Gesellschaftlichen Sein, which I believe is the ontology of social being in English. Translation seems to be Sato's. It is noteworthy that Lukacs referred to Engels for his famous insight into labor as a key to the transition from the sphere of nature to the sphere of society. Quote, Engels too investigates the biological precondition of a new role in the leap from animal to man. Same book, according to the footnote. End quote. According to Lukacs, it was Engels who pointed to the process of transition from ape to humans, which is of great importance in regard to the relationship between the realm of nature and that of society, asterisk. And that has to do with the labor changing in the hand in this kind of weird Darwinian hybrid Lamarckian way that Engels describes it in Dialectics of Nature, which, by the way, as a subject of anthropology is not entirely correct. It's also not completely wrong. There's a lot more going on in the transition between ape to man, as if men are not still apes. This is a problem in Marxian anthropology. How much 19th century human exclusivism is in it, but nonetheless. Obviously, Lukacs had in his mind his favorite passages in the fragment known as the part played by labor in transition from ape to man, which is included in Dialectics of Nature. Brought quote from Engels. Mastery over nature began with the development of the hand, with labor, and which widened man's horizons at every new advance. He continually discovered new, hitherto unknown properties in natural objects. On the other hand, the development of labor necessarily helped to bring the members of society closer together by increasing cases of mutual support and joint activity, and by making clear the advantage of joint activity to each individual. In short, man in the making arrived at a point where they had something to say to each other. Unquote. The problem with this, and this is Varn speaking, is that most other great apes who are social, which is most of them do similar things with their hand, have tools, do communicate, and live in bands, and work cooperatively. So that's not a good distinction between apes and humans, which is part of the problem with Engels' argument here. Lukacs making it important seems to be I'm going to be interested in dealing with that. Quote, in this passage, Lukacs discerns the existence of a leap, sprung, which emerged through the laboring activity as a joint activity because labor brings about something that is entirely new in terms of quantity in the sphere of nature. Quote, but Engels is equally at pains to point out that despite anticipations of this kind, there is a leap involved here no longer belonging simply to the organic sphere, but signifying a qualitative and ontological advanced principle beyond this. Ontology of social being, according to footnotes, unquote. According to Lukacs, labor brings in something that did not exist in nature without labor. This is, of course, a gradual historical process of natural evolution, but this continuation does not eliminate the character of the leap, which is equivalent to a quantitative break. Same text. What is this new quality that labor brings about? And is not just about the creation of new objects or new use values thanks to the development of hand skills. According to Lukács's interpretation of Engels, it is society and language that function as a foundation of social being of humans. Labor does not simply increase hand skill, enabling humans to work upon the external world in a more complicated way than the ape does. The development of the labor process also necessitates the division of labor and cooperation. Asterisk. You see divisions of labor and cooperation amongst chimpanzees and bonobos and gorillas. On asterisk. Back to the text. I'm just a bit frustrated. I know that Sato's only dealing with the text as given, but you're making scientific claims, some of which are transparently just like not all that true. The development of the labor process also necessitates the division of labor and cooperation. Such a social act requires communication. Quote, they had something to say to each other, unquote, which leads to the development of language and sociality at a broader level. Without going into the details of the further development of social being, it is clear that this leap from ape to human indicates a qualitative break between the realm of nature and the realm of society. Asterisk. Varn is getting mad because this is mythic. On asterisk. Obviously, humans are part of nature, as they are a product of natural evolution. Their existence is thus inevitably conditioned by natural law, asterisk, whatever that is, Varn says, on asterisk. And this metabolic interaction between humans and nature is a transhistorical physiological condition, as Marx pointed out in Capital Volume 1, according to the footnote. Engels traces the natural history from the transition, the natural history of transition from ape to human, but his contribution lies in pointing out the cognitive leap instead of reducing it to a natural process. And I'm guessing Sato's saying here that according to Lukács, that's what's going on. Because according to facts, Engels is a very brief sketch. It doesn't prove much of anything. Back to text. Engels' discussion apparently helped Lukács reformulate his old ideas, elaborating the footnotes of history and class consciousness, which led to his reevaluation of Engels and what Lukács and the ontology of social being aimed at establishing out of Engels' discussion is a dimension of the uniquely social that does not exist in nature without society. Lukács' attempt is obviously consistent with Marx's dialectical method that deals with the realm of capital society as manifested in social categories such as commodity, money, and capital. In this sense, there's a clear continuation in his focus on the purely social categories from history and class consciousness up until ontology of social being. So from the beginning to the end of Lukács' work, so says Varn. It is noteworthy that Lukács did not fully reject the existence of dialectics of nature, even in 1923. But the dialectics of nature, the dialectics of society do not exist either, as society emerges only out of nature. This is an emergence of kind problem. This is Varn talking. This is a philosophical problem. The problem is that, as I'm advocating and Saito doesn't deal with, the facts of science don't necessarily deal with this. This is actually what he'd already written and emphasized in Taylism and the Dialectic. Quote, self-evidently, the dialectic could not possibly be effective as an objective principle of development of society if it were not already an effective principle of the development of nature before society, if it did not already objectively exist. Lukács' Defensive History and Class Consciousness. Back to the text, this is Saito. According to Lukács, dialectics of society objectively exist only because the dialectics of nature exist prior to the formation of society and because society arose from nature. Asterisk. I mean, of course. And in some ways, trying to posit society as separate from nature is not just dualistic, it's a kind of special pleading. And it's good that Lukács is not guilty of it, whether or not we believe really the distinction Engels is making and Lukács is making a big deal of as a fact, not just as a theoretical construct. This remark alone is of great significance, for his recognition of the dialectic in nature is nothing but a complete negation of the basic characteristics of Western Marxism. Note, Saito doesn't put Western Marxism in quotations here. He takes it naturally, which I think is a sneaky thing to do, Saito. Also, you're not dealing with the fact, you're just refusing to deal with the science of this at all. Which is interesting given how much you make out of soil erosion in your book on eco-socialism, Saito. I just want you to notice I'm on to you. Right. Back to this text. However, it is also utterly wrong to directly apply the dialectics of nature to the realm of society, as Lukács warned in History of Class Consciousness. Notice that Saito has now let it slip that he agrees with Lukács. Back to the text. It is because there exists a quantitative leap between the two spheres, as Engels pointed out. In other words, Lukács found a way of not too strictly distinguishing the realm of society and the realm of nature, which resulted in the vehement criticism in the 1920s. At the same time, he did not eliminate the distinction of society and nature either. Already in Taylism and Dialectic, he attempted to clarify his intention by emphasizing the existence of the dialectics of nature prior to the existence of human beings. This is basically what he repeated in the ontology of social being through his reevaluation of Engels' dialectics of nature. This is why, in the ontology of social being, Lukács has repeatedly used the Hegelian expression, the identity of identity and non-identity, in order to designate the relationship between society and nature. On one hand, Lukács emphasizes there is a material identity, i.e., continuity, between nature and society, as society could emerge only out of nature. Nature as an undifferentiated totality of all things alive, by the way. This is Varn talking. The concept of nature is problematic in and of itself. In other words, nature functions as a material basis of society. Yeah, it would have to, because nature, according to this definition, it functions as a material basis of everything, because all things that exist in the world are natural. Because the things that produce things are also products of natural processes, unless you are some kind of substance or metaphysical dualist. Anyway. For example, value only exists when the commodity has a use value. Use value functions as a natural material bearer, tragar, of social category of value. Yeah. Things have use values, even if you're not human, because you use stuff. All right. On one hand, Lukács also emphasizes the non-identity, i.e., qualitative difference between society and nature. As in the case with value, there's a dimension of the purely social which emerges through symbolic activities associated with labor, such as communication necessitated through the division of labor. Asterisk. We would have to prove that communication emerged because of the division of labor and doesn't predate it, and that things that have divisions of labor, such as, I don't know, fucking ants, have similar developments. There's so many assumptions philosophically here that are super frustrating when you don't just take Marx and Engels at their word, and so much of this is Marxology, but will be extrapolated to fact. Grr. Anyway. With the development of capitalism, the social being multiplies. Here it is possible to think the Marx example in Capital. Money as a general equivalent form requires goal as its material bearer, and goal as money is a classic example of hybridity of the social and the natural. Because goal exists in nature, I guess. And goal only has value as a social form. As it is a commodity, money thus can be used to store value and as a means of exchange, although it's not the commodity money which most of us use anymore, nor is it the only thing he talks about in the group essay. All right. In this situation, it is not adequate to simply apply the dialectics of nature in order to conceptually grasp the social being, because the realm of society has its own equivalent different aspects, which requires a different kind of dialectics. So just because there's a dialectical emergence from nature does not mean the same dialectics apply to society as a whole, which I guess is actually like that's fair. That's both dialectically and logically consistent. Right. Lukács and the economic crisis. Does this mean that Lukács completely abandoned his critical view towards Engels' dialectic of nature? At least with regard to the dialectic, it is not possible to find a critical remark towards Engels as seen in History and Class Consciousness. There's nothing surprising about the shift per se, as Lukács went over significant theoretical changes through his life, as almost everyone does, including Marx and Engels. Back to text. However, this does not necessarily mean that theoretical progress and sophistication. One hint that indicates a difference from earlier view in the 1920s is reflected in the absence of the theory of crisis. Lukács' history and class consciousness, especially the most prominent reification in the consciousness of the proletariat, famously attempts to reveal the problems of natural science characterized by the contemplative attitude, that's in quotation marks, which brings about various contradictions in reality to the course of capitalist development. I'm leaving my frustration saying contemplative in. The point of Lukács' critique of modern science can be summarized in 4 points. The point can be summarized in 4 points? How does 1 point equal? Anyway, the first characteristic of natural science is immediacy. Nature is treated as given and can be objectively known as pure facts. Categories from nature can't be known as pure facts. Saito, our Lukács, our Engels, and Marx. Categories are never pure facts. They're tautological. And as tautological, they are dependent on our definitions of them. Thus, they are conditioned by social definitions, which makes the categories expressible. It's a philosophical problem. Anyway, back to the text. Second, there are pure facts that are attained through total quantification of the world. Modern natural science quantifies everything in a mechanistic fashion so that the objects can be formulated as regular, general, and predictable laws. Third characteristic is simplicity. Asterisk, as anyone knows, this is a paradox. Despite our focus on Occam's razor, over time, theories tend to get more complex, not less. So simplicity is not actually a criterion of natural sciences, even though we want to claim it is. It just doesn't happen to be the case. For the sake of the calculability, the complicated appearance of natural phenomena must be broken down to simple elements. This leads to reductionism. The fourth principle is ahistoricity. The mechanistic law of nature remains always the same, except when it doesn't. All right, this is Varn talking. There's a lot. Every one of these assumptions is problematic. For example, do the laws of gravity remain the same if centrifugal force is different in a body in motion? I mean, yes and no. Anyway, Lukács rejected these naive prepositions in the banner of formalism. Oh, good. Well, I agree with Lukács. I actually knew that was coming. I just wanted to point out the problems with these 4 points. But I don't think modern science still agrees with those 4 points. I think that's very much a Newtonian problem. Back to the text. Such formalism of natural science, so said Lukács, reflects the capitalist world of reification that quantifies everything for the sake of capitalist valorization. We put things in numbers because it reminds us of use value, I guess, because it's like money by analogy. Ultimately, formalism results in various disharmonies and discrepancies because of this fourfold extraction of complicated and quantitatively diverse reality. By the way, for those of you who got mad at me for critiquing overuse of statistics and call yourself Marxist, this is classical Marxism a la Lukács. It's actually even implied in Marx and Engels that part of the distortion of reification is forcing things into numerical abstractions that hide all that you're putting in the abstraction. It's what reification means in Marxism, that everything being considered is hidden in some kind of fetish, which itself starts acting as a feedback loop on reality. This formalization of natural science and technologies ultimately causes a real problem because the material side cannot be fully taken into account by capitalist relations. What I was just talking about. This destructive tendency against material and quantitative properties of things is an inevitable one as long as the formalistic and reductivist approach to natural sciences neglects the concrete material aspects and their real complexity. Block quote from History and Class Consciousness. This rational objectification conceals all immediate quantitative and material character of things as things. When use values appear as universally as commodities, they acquire new objectivity and new substantiability, which they did not possess in the age of episodic exchange, and which destroys the original and authentic sustainability. Or no, not sustainability, substantiality. There we go. The problem gets worse as capitalism develops, and the contradiction ultimately manifests as a crisis. Lukacs formulates this contradiction in the following way. Block quote from History and Class Consciousness. This rationalization of the world appears to be complete. It seems to penetrate the very depths of man's physical and psychic nature. It is limited, however, by its own formalism. This is to say that the rationalization of the isolated aspects of life results in the creation of formal laws, and all these things do join together what seems to be a superficial observer to constitute a unified system of general laws. But the disregard of concrete aspects of the subject matter of these laws, upon which to disregard their authority as laws is based, makes itself felt in the incoherence of the system in fact. This incoherence becomes particularly egregious in the period of crisis. At such times, we can see how immediate continuity between two partial systems is disrupted, and their independence from an advantageous connection with each other, advantageous connected with each other, is certainly forced into a consciousness of everyone. The unique way in which, this is Saito speaking, the unique way in which metabolism between humans and nature is organized in the context of capitalism and production is highly problematic because, due to the formal and reductivist nature of this approach, capital cannot take into account the material dimensions of the world. The natural ecological process of metabolism is mediated by capitalist organization of human labor, but its only goal is the valorization of capital, i.e., to make more money on paper. Back to text. Consequently, the dimension of the material is subordinate to the primacy of the added value production, which ultimately leads to the valiant manifestation of a contradiction in the moment of, quote, crisis, unquote. Again, this general approach is consistent with Marx's own approach. Famously enough, Marx argued that this creates the irreparable rift in metabolism between society and nature, as Marx argued in Capital Volume 3. In this way, large-scale land ownership, those in brackets and added to the text, but I didn't add it, produces conditions that provoke an irreparable rift in the interdependent process between social metabolism and natural metabolism as described by the natural laws of the soil. The result of this squandering of the vitality of the soil and the trade carries the devastation far beyond the bounds of a single country. That's one of the many metabolism theses that eco-socialists build their entire reading of Marx off of. Which, I mean, I think it's fair enough. It's actually a pretty important Marx thought, but it doesn't come up that much, even though it's important. All right, elasticity of capital and the collapse of capitalism. Unfortunately, the theory of crisis can no longer be found in Lukacs' ontology of social being. One possible reason for this is his reevaluation of Engels. The obvious problem that all Marxists confronted after the death of Marx and Engels is that capitalism did not collapse as a result of economic crisis. Rather, it continuously overcame the difficulties and even expanded further after eradicating outmoded production, aka what Schumpeter called creative destruction, or what other post-Marxists call it the business cycle. Anyway, back to the text. It is a new way of transcending the difficulties of developing new technologies and increasing productive forces. In short, capital proves much more elastic than Marx and Engels expected in the Communist Manifesto, and more elastic than Grossman expected in 1929, more elastic than people predicted in 2007. And people right now are predicting that we're currently in a final crisis, or that we've reverted to some kind of neo-feudalism to get out of this crisis, both of which seem to be an attempt to fix this problem. Notably, Marx himself started to emphasize the elasticity after the 1850s. Yeah, after the first time he predicted a collapse didn't happen, which he owned up to. That's Varn talking. The more aware he became of capital's ability to survive the severe economic crisis of the 1840 and 1857, the more attention he paid to capital's elastic power and how much it enabled capital to overcome its various limits. As a consequence, Marx fully gave up the view that capitalism would simply collapse as a result of economic crisis. Asterisk. Prove it to me. Because crisis theory of Marxism is still pretty given. I want a smoking gun as to where Marx gives it up, Saito. You can't just assert that. You got to give me evidence. I do think he changes his view on it. I mean, but there's a reason why people just don't accept that there is no crisis theory. As a consequence, Marx would fully give up his view that capitalism would simply collapse as a result of economic crisis. Asterisk. I once had a debate with Tom O'Brien when we were still friends about this, where he picked up Kleinman's view that Marx never actually thought this in the 1840s and 1850s, because in his version of Marxist humanism, it's very important that Marx is consistent throughout his life, which is weird and not supported by the text. As a consequence, Marx fully gave up his view that capitalism would simply collapse as a result of economic crisis, but rather he paid more attention to the highly elastic characteristic of capital, which utilizes the word both intensive and which utilizes the world in both intensive and extensive ways. In the manuscript for Capital, Volume 2, Marx wrote about capital's elastic potential as follows. Block quote, this is Marx. It simply indicates that capital advances as a given sum of value, which, in its free form, its value form consists of certain sums of money, contains, once it has been transformed into productive capital, productive powers whose limits are not given by bounds of its own value, but within a given field of action can operate differently in both extent and intensity. Asterisk for text being removed. However, the scale of which this capital operates from values to form values and products is elastic and variable. Capital M2, page 433, London Penguin edition from 1978. Capital utilizes very elastic characteristics of the world. For example, labor power is elastic and can be exploited more intensively and extensively to increase the rate of surplus value. Quote, labor power with a certain rate of payment may be more or less severely exploited, both extensively and intensively, unquote. This allows capital to produce much more flexibility in accordance with constant market fluctuations, i.e. it's variable capital. That's what labor is, unquote. In addition, capital can also attain its elasticity with the aid of scientific and technological advances, which elaborate to appropriate the, quote, free gift of nature to increase productivity. Nature is not simply free, but it is also quite elastic, quote. Natural materials are exploited productively, and which do not form an element of capital's value, i.e. soil, sea, mineral ores, forests, etc., may be more or less severely exploited in extent and intensity by later exertion of the same amount of labor power without an increase of the money capital advanced. Capital M2. Thanks to the development of natural science and technologies, capital can, for example, depend on the elasticity of nature for the sake of externalities. Capital need not pay for waste and pollutions, as the environment can absorb various negative impacts resulting from production and consumption without additional cost on capital. Asterisk, but as Saito is implying, and I'll point out, but on additional cost on the environment, aka unpriced externalities and even classical or neoclassical economics. However, despite Marx's emphasis in capital, the elastic character of capital is often neglected by later generations of Marxists. I mean, yeah, people, because it was in Capital Volume 2, which wasn't readily read by the Second International and barely read by the Third. Anyway. This is a common problem among Marxists, especially because historical materialism often supposes that the increasing contradiction between productive forces and the relations of production lead to a transcendence of the existing modes of production. Though the concept of elasticity, Marxism always falls into so-called breakdown theory. Of course, it might be fair to say that Engels did not explicitly advocate breakdown theory, but it is also true that he did not emphasize the elasticity either. And as a result, immediately after his death in 1895, various discussions on the breakdown of capitalist system emerged. This is from Paul Sweezy, Theories of Capitalist Development Principles of Marxian Political Economy. By the way, however, Paul Sweezy is a monopoly capital theorist, basing in the 1950s that the contradiction of capital had become. He's highly influential on Saito, and you can see that bias in the way Saito is interpreting this. And on that note of bias, I'm going to stop because there's still a bunch more pages. So we will go into part 3 soon.